Hey guys, this is going to be a rest day podcast. I'll try to get this up quickly. And the idea of this is I just put on Twitter or X, I put, ask me any questions you guys have about climbing performance or climbing for cycling. Can be training, whatever you have questions about improving your own climbing, or it could be let's talk about the climbing performances of the pros or in the Tour de France. So in this episode, I am just going to walk through the questions that I see on that you guys posted to my X, and I'm going to do it live. So I didn't look at them. I am just going to open my phone right here and read off them. And the reason for this is, one, just like it's like we're having an authentic conversation. I'm not scripted. I don't really know what questions are coming at me. And if I don't know the answer, I will just say, like, I don't have the answer. And I'll give the best possible suggestion on how to find the answer that I know. And this is kind of how I do my coaching, right? Like most of it comes from my own experience or the people that I've worked with and what I've learned from them. And so, I think that's the most powerful way to be a coach is, be authentic and use your own experiences and then also use your resources and tools around you. So here we go. Why we're talking about climbing is I think going into the last week of the Tour de France, climbing is going to be front center stage of what's going on. I think most people love climbing or at least wanting to improve climbing because, mountains are beautiful. It's some of the most iconic, incredible places to ride and see. And then, most races are decided some way or another around a climb or your group ride or whatever it is. And the final part is I love climbing too. That was my job as a pro athlete. I was a climber, a professional climber, not rock climber, cycling. But I won races on mountains and won Grand Tour or did well in Grand Tours on mountains. So here we go. Let me talk about it. So first question that I have here, is what were your favorite mountains to race as a pro and climb as an ex-pro? Well, first of all, my favorite climbs were the iconic climbs. I think, anytime, you go like just now I was in Italy and I rode the Dolomites and I rode, Stelvio in the Alps. And I, anytime you get on one of those like iconic climbs, they just hit different. I liked Alpe d'Huez. I thought that was a crazy climb. Col de Galibier, that was one of my favorite climbs. I prefer the steeper climbs to the shallower climbs. So anything that's steep and long, that was my favorite. Stateside, I would say my favorite climb would be Powder Mountain in Tour of Utah over there. Super steep climb, really, really hard, high altitude. That's Empire Pass is another one. I love Tour of Utah because it uniquely had really steep, hard climbs like we'd find in Europe, but with altitude. So it was best combination for me. Mount Washington over there, where I'm from in the East Coast. I love that one as well. So, all right, we're going to move on. Fastest way to improve your climbing performance as an average cyclist. Probably the same way the fastest way to improve your climbing performance as a pro cyclist. But in Cinch, we typically look at 4 pillars of training. And I think when we talk about speed and we talk about performance improvement, it's best to look at these 4 things. So the first one is fitness. The second one is technique. The third one is nutrition. And the fourth one is mindset or strategy. And so I'll quickly dive into those. To improve your climbing as a fitness side of it, you essentially want to raise your zones. So in Cinch, I like to talk about raising your zones in your medium. So it's your fat burning, your zone 2, raise your zones in your threshold. And so we have 3 threshold zones, but basically around that deflection point, around that threshold between where your body can get the amount of oxygen it needs, but right on that edge of that amount of oxygen it needs. And then your explosive zones, which are everything above your threshold, which is your shorter power, your higher octane power. And that's above your threshold. So you're using more oxygen than you can take in a moment. And that's why you're limited on that. So I think to improve your climbing, you've got to improve those 3 zone areas. People always focus a lot on the threshold and only raising the threshold. And that's like, from a testing perspective, that's the easiest thing to see your improvement, given like a 20-minute test or things like that. But if you were to have actually done a lactate test, when you do a lactate test, you look at everything below that threshold. And that's very, very important, that there's a smooth curve, there's this smooth level of efficiency below that threshold. And so as a pro athlete, we focus a lot on these zones below, because that's ultimately where you spend the most amount of time in your race. And if you are just as efficient as your threshold power, like you would do in your training, in your lower power, ultimately you end up using too much fuel, you fatigue, and you burn out too quickly on the rides and the climbs. And so I always believe in these lower zones as the fitness attack first. Is you want these zones below your threshold to be as efficient as possible. And so if you're looking to improve your climbing quickly, really build some lower intensity training and structure it in intervals. And the reason why I say to do that is you can keep track of the amount that you're doing and the power that you're doing them in, and you can quickly rip through the ranks of efficiency there. Easier to say, I guess, is quantify everything. You want to too often people just put everything below the threshold, or into sweet spot or zone 2 or whatever it is. And I think you need to be even more specific with that, because when you go to the climbs, you want to know exactly the zone that you're riding on the climbs. So general answer for that. But first, fitness, I would say first attack everything below the threshold, and then next I would attack everything above the threshold. That gets your fitness ceiling up, that increases your VO2 max, and that will create more house or more room for you to move your threshold into. And every time that you basically ride or race or even ride climbs, a lot of times you're just bouncing across the threshold, almost like a volleyball game, where you're below your threshold, and then you're above your threshold, and you're below your threshold, and you're above your threshold. So I'd say the fastest way to improve is to improve those 2 things first, and then get in there and put those levels, those floors, a little bit of threshold training there. But it's funny because everybody just triples down on the threshold. They think, oh goodness, I'm climbing, I need to improve my watts per kilo at the threshold and this and that. And even as a pro athlete, most of the pros always do, just like we're talking about, almost like a volley across that threshold. You're almost never just right smack on it. It's just not the most useful way to train. It takes it's the fastest way to get good at that one particular zone, but like I said, you almost never use it. And if you're doing climbing, you're doing long climbing, or you're doing repeated climbing, which is probably one of the things that you're going to be doing, you need to have efficiency in those 2 areas, like I was talking about. All right, quickly, technique. What do you need to work on? Positioning on your bike. So like hand position, where you sit on your seat, and then what you do with what you do with your feet. That is important because it is how you use your muscle groups on the bike, and having a locked in position on the bike is going to enable you to hold yourself where you need to be to then do the right motion, and you don't have those muscles fatiguing like you normally would. Now, a lot of people incorrectly look at cycling, and they read all these studies on the internet, and they say, well, there's actually no benefit to having any pedal technique, blah, blah, blah. Well, again, these studies are simply just measuring pure power output on indoor trainers. It is completely different when you actually have to balance your body and balance your weight out on these courses for hours and hours on end. And you're having to deal with terrain that's forcing you in one position and terrain that's forcing you in another position. And then you're starting to have fatigue in your lower back and your arms and all these other things. Technique does matter a lot. And pedaling technique also can help you create more power because you are more efficient in the way that you're generating that power over time. And again, a lot of these studies are not looking at, for example, an hour-long climb, a Stelvio or something like this, where how you're holding your body on your bike is going to deteriorate over the course of the climb. And if you are unable to push a certain way towards the top of the climb as you are at the bottom, you're gonna slow down. You're gonna struggle. You're gonna get cramps. You're gonna get these things. So the ways that you hold yourself on the body will help you create more power, and it will also be able to create an opportunity for you to be able to hold that power longer, which is super, super important. Nutrition, this is a huge thing. Climbing is about glycogen, being able to, one, use it efficiently, and two, have enough of it. So, what does this mean? Well, we go back to zones. It means that you're able to climb these climbs in a lower zone that uses less glycogen than, say, the threshold, right? So you want to have the efficiency and the ability to do that. So that goes back to the first part of this conversation. The second part is you need to fuel your day properly, fuel your ride with a big carbohydrate meal. And then on the bike, you need to be able to eat while you're riding. And I was just at the Stelvio, just out there in Italy, some of these long climbs where we're just on the climb for an hour, pushing a pretty hard pace. I was eating gels while I was climbing. Back in my day when I was racing, we didn't really have good gels and we had to eat bars. And so nowadays, you guys, we have phenomenal gels too. I use Never Second, but you guys probably have something you love. But just, being able to practice while you're training at home, eating every 30 minutes on the bike, that goes a long way, because when you do end up on the Stelvio, or you do end up in this really difficult race or climb that you're training for, you need to have the experience on how to eat while you're breathing hard, when your stomach doesn't feel good, when you're using your muscles. Super difficult. So nutrition, such a big part of climbing. So remember, again, climbing equals glycogen. And so anytime you prepare to do a climbing training or climbing effort, you need to also think, okay, what is the meal that I'm eating before, the night before, the day before? What does it look like? Is it pasta? Is it rice? Is it oatmeal? Is it pancakes? And then on the bike, do I have enough carbohydrates for this ride? Super, super important. Last bit, mindset. This is a cool one. We do a lot with this in Cinch, but mindset really just comes down to being able to use your brain to control your effort. And this is something a lot of people overlook, that in cycling, it is a sport that people often just think comes automatically, but it is just like being a race car driver. You have to drive the car. You are the car. Your bike you on the bike is the engine, and you have to operate it. And a lot of times the pain, the suffering, the struggle, being uncomfortable, insecurity, all these things, they limit our ability to navigate and pilot the car. Just think about like when you're driving or something like that. If you have a close call, or you have a crash, or you're fatigued and you're tired, you've been driving for a long time, or you're distracted or whatever, you just don't drive as well. So it's the same thing on the bike. You need to have that mindset when you're climbing to be super checked in, super locked in, and able to really do a phenomenal job controlling your body. I call this in Cinch one-way communication. With climbing, you practice this idea where you are sending this message from your brain to your body while you're climbing. You're not thinking about, asking your body how it's feeling and how it's doing. You're only sending the command to the body. You're saying, okay, legs, we're pushing this way. Gears, we need, hands, we need to shift. Eyes, we need to look ahead. Breathing, I need to open my stomach up and get the deep breaths in, get the shallow breath stopped and reorganized. And so it is super, super important to practice this one-way communication in your intervals, in your training, and also practice the way that you are doing your one-way communication, because that is an art as well. Just like I'm talking in this podcast, I'm not saying I'm good, I probably suck at this, but just like if you're a public speaker and you're giving talks and you're trying to lead people, or even just normal communication where you're trying to get your point across to people, the efficiency, the effectiveness of your communication matters. And it's the same in climbing, that you start these climbs, you start these efforts, and you know exactly what you're going to say to your body. Because when you get out there and the heat hits and the pressure hits, there's all these things that happen. Legs hurt, the body hurts, the respiration is short and shallow. You start questioning, can I get to the top? Do I have what it takes? Am I good enough? all these conversations come up, and you need that same skill that you might have when you are like giving a talk, or you're communicating with someone, and something happens that you aren't ready for it, and you still have to keep talking. You still have to get your point across. Same thing with one-way communication and climb. So mentally, you want to improve your climbing performance quickly, get that one-way communication skill down, start practicing it in your intervals, and you will see massive improvement to go along with those other 3 pillars of performance. So that's a long answer how to quickly improve your climbing. All right, this next question, I'm not going to take every single question if they start repeating themselves, but I'm just looking down, there's already a bunch that are asking this. What are the power numbers for the what are the power numbers for the climbers while they're in zone 2? This has been a hot topic since Tadej got on the podcast, and on Peter Attia's podcast, and mentioned like what is power numbers in zone 2. And I think this is funny, and I'm gonna address this in kind of 2 parts. First thing is, zone 2 is extremely subjective unless you are doing lactate testing and you know exactly what your zone 2 is. Now, most of us interpret zone 2 as either a heart rate range or just a simple power range that's calculated off of a threshold number, or our coaches have put it there, or whatever it is. But at the end of the day, getting specific about your zone 2 is like your new FTP competition, because FTP is the same way. What's FTP is like a percentage off your 20-minute power, which means so again, it's just an abstract measurement that's not actually a real thing. It's like, well, I didn't go in a lab and I didn't test where my 4 millimoles deflection point is, or I didn't actually like do a climb and take my lactate with my time on my climb, and I understand what my body's doing when I did this time on the climb, or I'm not taking my power on this climb and then I'm taking the lactate after it. It's all super subjective. And so to use this as a comparison is like, we're absolutely worthless. And as a coach, I've really forced this, or not forced, but I've really promoted this way of thinking to get away from these abstract measurements as kind of understanding what our true performance is, and instead think about really what our true zones are and how they relate to what's needed to do in the performance in the race. So I'm going to kind of answer this question on that front, because again, we can go back to Tadej Pogačar and we can say, does 340 watts at zone 2, and therefore like that's most people's threshold, and therefore like we have no hope. But the truth of the matter is, what Tadej Pogačar and how he wins races and how these pro race wins races is not in this area, because like the below the threshold, the areas that he's using fat as a fuel, a lot of the other professional athletes are quite similar. The same way as if you look at your local group ride or your local competition group, that you're in races with, if you were to go take lactate measurements in the lower zones, you guys all would be pretty close in terms of what power and what lactate or what energy system you're using. And so all zone 2 means, from a coaching perspective and a testing perspective, is this is like your highest power that you can use fat as a fuel. And so when Tadej says, yeah, I'm doing 340 watts at this power, in fact, the context that he talks about is he's doing climbs. You're not just holding for 5 hours. This was kind of misleading in the podcast. This was, hey, if I'm at my house, he says, if I'm in Monaco, I'm out riding, I'm at Nice, I'm training on the climbs, I'm repeating climbs in zone 2. Yeah, I'm about 340 watts. Now that completely checks out, right? That's about what these top pro guys are doing, is this in zone 2. But again, instead of calling it zone 2, let's just call it, this is the power they can do using fat as a fuel. And this is important if you want to know, how do these riders like Tadej go out in these big Grand Tour stages and recover day in, day out? Well, this is it. They are able to climb these big climbs at a fast pace using fat as a fuel. And so that's the benefit to this discussion, is understanding, yes, there is a lot of value in training. And goes back to, we asked, how can you improve your climbing quickly? There's a lot of value in training to being able to increase those power zones that are below your threshold that use fat as a fuel to climb quite quickly. And that's how, if we look at these gravel races, these riders that are doing well at the ends of these gravel races, well, yeah, they're able to go in the first part of these gravel races and use less sugar, use more fat. They have a higher efficiency, or higher power with fat as a fuel, and they are able to then have more glycogen later on in the race and make that selection. The same with Tadej. So what are the power numbers while the athletes are in their zone 2 or using these using fat as a fuel? I would say these top pros, if they're a lighter rider like a climber, Jonas, Tadej. Jonas is probably 300 watts or 290 watts to 310 watts, and Tadej is probably 320 to 340. That's about what these riders are, where they're using primarily fat as a fuel, and they're able to climb. So if you're on the wheel, and this is also helpful, and this was the same as me, is when I was racing, if I'm on the wheel, if I'm behind the teammates or I'm behind in the peloton, there can be riders that are on the front that are pulling, let's just say I did 300 watts, I did about 310, 300 in my zone 2, right? With my using fat as a fuel. That was kind of my upper level. And I could sit on the wheel where a rider would be doing 360, 370 or something like that on the climb, pulling over 6 watts per kilo or 6.5 watts per kilo with the speed that the pros travel at. You're on the wheel. You can get the intensity level down enough where you can be on the wheel and use fat as a fuel, while the riders that are on the front, your teammates or the other riders, are using sugar or glycogen as a fuel. And so again, that's how they'll wear the riders down through the course of the stages. Oftentimes too, in the beginning of these races, everybody goes so hard. All the riders use glycogen on the first climb or the second climb, and then it's the climbs after where the top riders are able to get back down into that fat as a fuel power, and the other riders, in the peloton, the pace that it's going, they're having to use glycogen, and then when they get to the last climb, they're out of glycogen, and the final riders, they can go ahead and attack. And this is to even further elaborate on this. This is why I thought kind of the Visma strategy was not a good strategy, of scorched earth, attacking, pulling on the front, doing all this craziness, because the riders behind, they are using 1 or 2 zones less in the draft. And so when Matteo is attacking, or Jonas is on the front, or the team is sprinting on this corner or out of this corner or whatever it is into a crosswind, those riders are just using that little bit more glycogen, while the riders behind, especially Tadej, are not using that glycogen. And as the muscles get damaged throughout the course of a Grand Tour, no matter how well you eat afterwards, you don't replenish them the same way with needed glycogen. And so when you use that important glycogen in these Grand Tours, you don't always get it back. And so that's when we talk about managing your effort and being conservative or using your energy wisely through Grand Tours, it's more about this. And so a higher zone 2, a higher ability or higher power using fat is super beneficial. But again, my point of this whole rant is you really can't compare person to person. You can just kind of understand that there is this range that these athletes are able to go to. And if you're a Jonas or you're a Tadej, you're still, again, focused on the top zones, the top level, and your efficiency in this area just happens. I would say zone 2 and riders' efficiency using fat as a fuel is like foundational. All of them can do it. All of them have a high level. You can't even finish these races unless you don't have it. And so it's not as exciting as people make it sound. But yes, when you compare top World Tour cyclists to normal cyclists, there's a big difference, but there is a big difference on so many different levels. And so next question is, when do you look at decoupling to start and ending the ride, so you are not burning as many recovery matches and you continue to improve? And so the way I look at the question is decoupling, and essentially that is like when there's a difference between heart rate and power, it goes off one way or the other. As the ride goes on, the same power doesn't yield the same heart rate as the rider fatigues. And at what point do you say that's too much decoupling? Or I like to keep it a little bit simpler than this, because this is just so depends on the day type of thing. Depends on the weather. Depends on the day, the block of the training is. There's so many factors that can really change how your body reacts to multiple efforts and what it does. And so I just simply like to look at it as, can you do it or can you not? And as you go through your training and you go through your time, you're simply looking at the number of repeated efforts you can do and what ends up happening with that. And so being more specific with that, I'm talking about repeated low threshold, and explosive, above the threshold efforts, and looking at them over the course of a training workout or a training or a race. And it's funny because if you look at a race performance, and my mindset really comes from racing with this, because whether you can do it or you cannot is at the end of the day how it works in racing. You can have all these cutesy measurements and all these numbers and all these predictions and whatever, but when you get to the race, you literally can either do it or you can't. You either repeat 3 of these and you crack on the 4th, or you repeat 4 of them. And so I like to break it down into that as simple perspective, looking at is like, okay, how much time in these zones are you doing? What is the duration of these efforts? How, it's funny because when you look at a lot of the races, it's so much clearer and obvious what you're actually doing. And you go and look at a lot of this training methodology that's out there on the internet, or in coaching and in cycling, and none of it even adds up to actually what's happening in the race, and we've kind of lost our way a little bit, where we're just chasing all these like ways to create a workout that's hard, instead of thinking, okay, what is my body actually doing? What do I need to do to be able to repeat this effort? And how do I raise this zone if I need to raise the zone? And so, long answer here, but when we are looking at your body's ability to repeat efforts, it's as simple as that, is that you are making sure that you are training, repeating the effort just like you're going to be doing in the race. It's so simple, and yet so many people lose the plot. And a lot of times people are training workouts and rides with way too much effort and work in a zone that's not even used in the race or for their goal. And if your training is around the idea of more, so if you are trying to get a higher threshold power, you're trying to raise your zones through more training, you're in trouble. And this is something I learned in the World Tour too, is if you need 40 hours a week to figure out where your form is, or you need a certain amount of training load to get your body to improve, you don't have the right process, because you want to have a way to improve your physical engine by doing something that you can replicate every single day of your life without breaking down, without needing to be on an incredible island of paradise, without needing to change your life, without needing to change your diet or change any of these things. You need to have a process that you can repeat day in, day out, that actually gets you better, that doesn't need to add more to it, right? And then when I say more, I mean more reps or more volume. You can add more power, right? Just like in the weight room. But I am not a big fan of this idea of always increasing more to get more fitness. And so back to this, decoupling question that I'm going on this rant with is you want to create your durability through a clear understanding of how many efforts need to be done to kind of replicate or achieve the goal that you're looking to do, and start by doing that. If you're training for Unbound or something like that, you can basically look at how much time in the threshold zones and how much time in the explosive zones you actually need in that 12-hour, that 9-hour, that 15-hour race. And then you can look and see how much time is needed in these lower zones. In that case, those are fat burning. And you don't necessarily need to replicate massive amounts of time in fat burning zones. Your body is already super efficient in that. You just need to put yourself in a situation where you can do a long duration in those zones and not break down. So it's subjective to some degree, but I would say, the overall plot is, when you're training durability, which I'm assuming this question is, it's more about, okay, how many climbs are you needing to do? What's the perfect zone to be using on those climbs? And then can I repeat that amount of time over, of just the climbing? And that's it. So I think I got a little confusing on that. Hopefully I made sense, and I can even answer this question more and more as I do more of these podcasts and improve my answer. So next one is feeding while gasping for air while climbing. What's better, before, during, or after the climb? And I kind of talked about this on how to improve quickly your climbing. And I think, you want to be able to eat on the climb, and you want to be able to eat while you're breathing hard. Super hard to do, but just like anything in life, it just comes down to practice. And what I like to do is practice doing it while I'm doing my intervals. I do a lot of, say I set up a workout, or even my athletes set up a workout. In the beginning, you might have some lower intensity intervals, like medium efforts. Then you have some threshold intervals, and threshold intervals, you're almost never going to eat when you're at that high of intensity. And so those zone 2 intervals, and that endurance type riding, that's where you can really start to practice eating. You might one day need to desperately eat during a threshold interval, but in general, you almost never would want to eat during that. So you want to practice eating on these medium intervals, zone 2 intervals, and you want to practice it in training. It's super uncomfortable. I've been doing it my whole life, and I still don't like it. And so I think just looking at it as less of a nuisance and more of a need, and just say, hey, this is uncomfortable. I always tell people, this is bike riding, this is bike racing. We're not looking for couch comfort. We're looking for execution. We're looking for just getting it done. And so stop looking for the perfect feeling and just start practicing. Okay, this is what's needed. And so, I would practice eating on the climbs if it's not a threshold effort. And then if it is a threshold effort, then I would make sure that you eat before and after the climb every single time. And one more example I'll give is say I'm doing a training ride in Boulder here. I've got 3 mountains, say I'm going to do 3 15-minute efforts. And what I'll do for my nutrition and for eating is I will eat before each one and I will eat after each one. And so the before is to kind of pad the glycogen, pad the system with having a little extra for the effort, so it doesn't deplete me as much. And then I will hit a gel right after the effort, and that is in hopes to absorb that and hopefully store it and have it ready for, or at least have it in my system, have it ready for the next climb, so I can pad myself. But you need to take it as seriously as possible, because it does really make a big difference. And as you know, I'm sure you've experienced, once the glycogen storages go out, the climbing ability goes down tremendously. So don't do it. Okay, the next one is, it's always intriguing to look at the evolution of climbing bike positions, seated out of the saddle, but seated versus out of the saddle has always been a fascination to me. People are interested in the two differences. And this is a good point because, on my Instagram page, I talk a lot about different climbing techniques, and I always do some stuff about standing, and people say, well, standing's bullshit. Nobody stands anymore. And then, like Tadej's seated, so everyone needs to be seated. And this is in a nutshell, standing is the easiest way to increase your power. So if you are looking to do more power, then standing technique is worth you learning. And if you look at Tadej when he's riding, anytime he needs more power, he stands up. Now he's trained himself to such a high level that he can stay seated and do more power than everybody else on the planet. But I wouldn't necessarily use him as an example of the right way to do things unless you also have more power than anyone else on the planet. If you are like me and anyone else that does not have the maximum power possible for a human being, then you probably need to learn to stand if you'd like to be closer to the people that are faster than you. And so if you look at Jonas, if you look at a lot of these other riders, they do have to stand quite a bit. And what standing on climbing does is it helps you use your body weight and put it into the pedal stroke to create more power. So a lot of times we're looking for 20 more watts, we're looking for 30 more watts, and we're looking for it in maybe a short period of time. Maybe there was an attack that happened. Maybe there's a steep section of the climb that's coming up. How do I get that? Well, if I just add, my 140 pounds, I stand up, I put it into the downstroke, and I move it side to side, I drop it in each downstroke. Well, then I'm able to get that additional force that I was looking for, and I can find that 20, 30, 40 more watts in the moment that I needed. Sometimes we attack, sometimes we add on 200, 300, 400 more watts. Again, that 140 pounds, that becomes a massive use. Now, let's talk about Tadej. Now, he's on a complete other level because he has trained his core strength and his ability to hold himself on the bike. And so he doesn't even need to use his body weight. He has enough force in his hips, in his glutes, in his quads, that he is able to push that same force that I would need standing to get the same output that he's looking for. It's as simple as that. So, it's not an efficiency thing. It is a need situation. Now, is it more efficient long-term to stay in the saddle than to go in and out of the saddle? Well, technically, yes, right? It is also more aerodynamic to stay in the saddle. And I think these are some of the reasons why Tadej has focused and doubled down on it. But if you look at Tadej from the beginning of time and when he was a junior, he did a lot of his efforts seated because again, he's got this strong core, kind of big glutes, big hips, which is not common for a lot of climbers. And so I think he's taken advantage of that and really reinvented the wheel here, and being able to do this insane amount of power seated. But is it better to do that? Well, I don't think majority of us can even come close to creating that amount of force seated. So I think it's worth learning how to stand. Everybody else stands. So I think, and even Pogačar stands quite a bit. So learn your standing. I think it's worth it. And this is a whole other conversation. If you check out Cinch Cycling Instagram, I have a lot of standing stuff there. And I'm going to put some standing courses and some other types of courses on our website. So check those out, cinchcycling.cc, and that's coming. All right. What torque do pros climb with, and how do they train to achieve this? Well, I mean, this is a whole other conversation. I would say that this is an area where became really fascinated as a coach and as an athlete in the last year or so. And mainly with looking at how we can improve our zones. I think learning more about your force production, torque, circular force, right? Learning more about that is ultimately the key to being able to do higher power at higher zones. Now, what do the pros do? Well, the pros are doing, 40 to 50 Newton meters of torque. And I don't know how many people understand what that even means, but basically power, which is your watts, which is your output, which is sending the bike forward. Well, that's a function of how much torque you're producing, so your circular force, and then how many times a minute are you rotating that. And that's your output, that's your watts, that's what's pushing you forward. And so essentially, when we went back to, in the earlier part of this podcast, we were talking about we were talking about pedaling technique, and then how there's all these studies that say you don't actually need a pedal stroke and all this other stuff. Well, now we're coming fast forward here to this idea of like, how do we create this high force, and then how do we send it forward with all these revolutions? Well, technique is how you do it, folks. Like it's exactly how you do it. And so if you look at Pogačar, you see this heel up technique. This is new in the peloton. Before we were always dropping our heel. Now we're keeping it up. They call this calf flexion. So what the idea here is, you're able to use your glute sooner in the pedal stroke and further through into the bottom of the pedal stroke. And so athletes, the pros specifically, are now with this new technique. They're learning how to create more force with this new technique. And then by not dropping the heel, then you can pull through the bottom of the pedal stroke. You can get it up quicker. And by keeping the heel up over the top, you can use the hip flexor. And you can nail that glute sooner on the downstroke with that heel up. It's pretty cool if you think about it. Even like women using high heels, one of the reasons I think my wife wears high heels, we were talking about this the other day, is because it activates the glutes, right? So like this heels up technique, maybe it originated from women wearing heels. I don't know, but it works and it helps you create more torque. We train it in cinch like crazy. But it is so cool. Working on this and seeing that the actual torque numbers go up, and then this technique, so you're able to pedal this at a higher frequency, a higher RPM, and go faster, and that creates more watts and goes forward. So again, I know I'm just blabbing, but to answer your question, there's so much here. The top pros, they do a decent amount of force, like we were talking about. But the key is that they're able to take that force and repeat it over and over and over again, efficiency, using their technique. And then also that technique allows them to use this higher cadence, which also takes less of a strain on your cardiovascular system, because that is your limit. Your aerobic system is your limit to being able to take that muscular force, that circular force, and repeat it over and over again at a fast rate, moving it forward. So the top pros, they're training these two things independently, right? They're training their ability to create the total force that's needed for this zone at the lactate, at the oxygen demand that they're needed to perform. And then they're able to replicate it over and over and over again using the aerobic system and technique and efficiency, so they can send themselves forward up a hill. So pretty cool concept. There's so much there. I'd love to, maybe we'll do a whole podcast on it. We work a ton in cinch. Our training is around building zones using torque and cadence. It's a total game changer, and technique. It's massive. I would love to talk more about it. This one person asked, try and explain Pogačar's recovery. I would say in a nutshell, here it is. And we've kind of talked about it already, but he has higher zones than everybody, and therefore he's using less energy, less fuel in the races than everyone, and that equates to faster recovery than the other riders. The other side of it, which not a lot of people talk about, is his mindset. I think that he carries less stress, less anxiety, produces less cortisol over these races, and therefore the chaos, the stress, the unpredictable nature of racing, I think that he's at peace with all those things. I think he enjoys it. I think he's kind of like a kid out there playing video games, and he thrives off it. Whereas I know when I race, I was super nervous all the time, and that cortisol built up. I created a lot of inflammation. It hurt, my immune system and my recovery over the course of a grand tour. So I think his mindset really gives him an advantage over the other riders, where he looks at it like a game. He enjoys playing the game. I don't think it really costs him anything to be out there playing the game. I don't think while he's racing the Tour de France, he's out there, wishing it was over. wishing he was already the winner. I know myself, when I was racing and I had the leader's jersey, a lot of times I was like, I just wish it would end right now and I could go home and put my jersey on the wall or whatever it is and move on with things and go on a nice recovery ride. I generally think, like we saw in stage 15, where he's in the front group of the racers and they're trying to go in the break and he's up there playing around along with them. I think he feels like you on the Tuesday night group ride, where he's like, this is freaking fun, guys. Like, I love that there's this drama here. I love that you're mad at me and I'm chasing you down. Haha. Like, you know, like, hey, look, your GC guys dropped, but I'm up here. What are you going to do about it? Like, I think he just loves that stuff. And, he just loves playing the game. So I think that is what leads, kind of cool. Makes him better. Okay. So next question. How do Jonas, Pogačar, top 10 GC riders train for long and hard climbs? This is a great question, actually. And how do they train for explosive climbs? And so this comes down to the same concept we use in cinch, which is the zones are real. We call it the zones are real. And so it's less about training on the climb, and it's more about making sure that you have the zone efficiency ready to do the climb. And so you heard me talk a little about this idea of low threshold. And this is we'll call it on the lactate curve. It's just below the 4 millimoles. It's in the 3. It's between the 3.5. It's this point where it's almost as much power as the threshold, but it's lower lactate, which means it's using less glycogen, it's using less oxygen. And from this point, you can do it longer, you can repeat it more times, and then you can even do surges and attacks from it and come back to it, clear the lactate, use the lactate, and regain your oxygen delivery to your muscles, because you're not in a deficit, you're getting a surplus. So low threshold is key. And so these riders train these low thresholds and high medium zones over and over and over again at home. And you don't need to do long intervals, although it's good to do them to practice the mindset, practice the efficiency, the feel, the core body temperature going up, things like that. But you don't necessarily, once you know where these zones are, your coach knows where these zones are, you can break them into smaller intervals. I do it, here in Longmont. I have a short climb. If you follow me on Strava, you see Col de Somerset. It's like 4-minute climb. It's right by my house, like with my work, my job, my family. I can bust out to it. I did all my, Italy training, steamboat training, all, big climb training on this 4-minute climb. And again, I'll do days where I'm just repeating the 4-minute effort at this low threshold, repeating it over and over again. And I know that I can take this zone the way that I've been training it and take it to the Stelvio and do the entire Stelvio at this power. In fact, I did go over there and do 1 hour, of this effort. In the beginning of the year, even, we had this Tucson training camp. We do this with our group all the time. And we did this 1 hour fun challenge where we did it up Mount Limit. And on this, we said, okay, we're going to see if we can hold our low threshold for this whole hour. And we're going to practice what we have been doing on Zwift, on training, in our short intervals. And we're going to do it on this 1 hour mountain that's, in the middle of the wintertime. We're out here in the desert. We're going to do it. And everyone can do it. In fact, most people broke their 1 hour PR, lifetime PR, doing it. So the way these guys train is they're working these zones all the time. In shorter durations, shorter efforts. It's also easier mentally to train a shorter effort than going out and doing a 30-minute mountain over and over and over again. So these riders oftentimes are doing 15 minutes, 10 minutes, something like that. They'll go out and do, they'll find some climbs, they'll find some flat roads, whatever it is, they'll do those efforts, they'll repeat it. And then, of course, going into the Tour de France, they'll do Dauphiné, they'll go do a training camp on these big mountains, and they'll start to put those zones and those efforts into place on the big mountains. But it's expensive. I don't think anyone really needs to be doing 30-minute threshold, low threshold effort after 30-minute low threshold effort. They don't really need to be doing the exact thing that they're going to be doing in the race. They just need to be doing the zone that they use. All right. Question for the podcast. Vingegaard's attack with Pogačar's seated response. It looked effortless and ease. What is your view? A little bit less about climbing, but I'll make it about climbing. So in this, we've seen Pogačar cover the attack of Jonas on stage 14 seated. He didn't jump with him right away. And I think, anytime you're able to cover someone well within your zones, it's an added benefit. And so the seated part of it, I don't necessarily think that was anything more than him just trying to use the least amount of energy possible, knowing that he has the same, if not more. Well, we know he has more. He has more power seated in that zone than Jonas. And so it's a difficult situation for Jonas to be in, right? Because, like when you don't have as much weaponry as your enemy, then you don't really have the option, the warfare. So you got to do the best you can. You got to hope that you're going to catch him on a bad day, or hope you're going to catch him on a cramp or something like that. And you got to keep trying too, because cycling is a sport. Climbing is a sport where not every day is the same. And you guys know too, with your workouts and your intervals, they're designed a lot of times with your exact numbers and in ratios that you've done before and numbers that you've done before. And, you go out and you do these intervals and you can't do them some days. Some days you just can't even finish your workout. And so Jonas and Visma, they've got to, again, use the strategy where they just keep showing up and hope that, Tadej has a day where he just can't do his intervals. And long story, I'm ranting on this. I think that's why he was so conservative on that stage 14. Is just like, I don't think he was having a good day. I don't think he felt super good. I think he knew he was stronger than Jonas. So when Jonas attacked, he brought it back slowly. He didn't overexert himself. He waited to the last minute, jumped at the line, got some more time, sort of managed the effort a little bit. And I think, in context for climbing, I think that's a real good strategy for all of us, is that if you're riding with another rider that's more explosive or feeling better than you, I think you got to play the long game and stay more within yourself and don't go with every single surge. Smooth it out, ride it more in your zones, ride it more your pace. And that's going to help you more towards the top of the climb feel a lot better. Okay. What was your best 30-minute climbing performance in watts per kilo? That's kind of funny. I would say probably one of my best climbing performances was I went and did a test on Col de la Madone. I ended up breaking Lance's record. I think I maybe have like the second best time on that to Tadej, I think, beat it. And that was about a 30-minute effort. And I think I was close to 7 watts per kilo. I know I was about 7 watts per kilo for 30 minutes. And the big thing with me is I wish I knew a lot of what I know now back then, is that for me, like the durability on these zones I didn't really train. In fact, I trained a lot to do what we're talking about. So I had this like amazing top end climbing 30-minute, 20-minute ability, but I didn't have any efficiency, just like we talked about at the beginning of this podcast, is I didn't really train or respect all those zones below the threshold. And it really wasn't until later in my career where I started to pay more attention. So I think on the Madone, I did about, I want to say like 420 watts. I was about 60 kilos, 59 kilos, something like that. And yeah, I mean, that's 7 right there. And like, I never worked on, I always worked on that. And I never worked on all the things below it. And it wasn't until this last part of my career where I, started paying more attention to the 340s and the 320s and the 300s and the 290s. And it's funny because that's when I really started getting the biggest results of my career, because you never won, at least, back in my day, like you never won the race with 420 on the last climb. You couldn't do it. And so I think that's why a lot of the riders are so much better now, is they, at a young age, 15, 16, 14, 17, whatever, at a young age, they're training these zones. They're training the 320s. They're training the 340s. They're training the 290s. They're getting all that done. And, they're learning how to do the 400. They're learning how to do the the 420, but they're doing it in a smaller amounts. And as they mature and as they get older, then they can do it longer and longer and longer towards the ends of their rides. And they're so efficient in all these other zones that it's not like me where, I rocked up in my 20s. I'm doing these super high power numbers. And then I'm learning in my 30s that, okay, all these other numbers are actually more important. And I think that's just the evolution of the sport. I think that's the evolution of all this where, we're learning that you can and need to train all the abilities in these other zones. And you still can train that 420. You still can train that super high number, but it's not the only thing you train. And you don't spend an insane amount of energy on it. It just is there if you're doing all the right amounts of training everywhere. That's Tadej and his group. Yeah, they've all pushed the envelope on what's possible. And yeah, now you can do tons and tons of 340 and 360 and 370, and then finish her off with a whatever he does, 450 or 460 at the on the last climb. So the evolution of cycling and training, and it's cool to see. And the most important thing is that people don't need to do bad things to their health and things like that to achieve these performances now, because they've got time and they've got good trainers and good coaches and a good process. So it's cool to say, but I think I should try to dive in on a whole conversation. Next question, Tom, how about a climbing metrics? Watts, VAM, sustainable heart rate, FTP power, VO2 max. Which are the best predictors of climbing performance and the most meaningful to focus on in training? Well, they all are important, but I think if I were to be a director and I'm looking to see, who I would want to have on my team that was a good climber, I think that what I would look for is that low threshold and to see what power this athlete can do at the low threshold. And then on the flip side, what explosive type power can they do above the threshold? So, what is their 4-minute power? What is their 2-minute, something like that? What is that top end, kind of puncher type explosive 4-minute, 3-minute, 2-minute power? What does that look like? And then what does that 3 millimoles, 3.5 millimole lactate power look like? What are those two things? Because pretty much if you can get the right combination with those two measurements, knowing what we know now with training and in Cinch, we have something new. I've created this kind of cool target modeling. So, being able to use past performance data of racing and other athletes that have accomplished big results, and then mapping out, knowing those reference points, mapping out the training path and training progression, and then what milestones for that person to hit along the way. So if I would say that those two power numbers are the most important, and then you can just from that grab the watts per kilo and say, all right, what are they? And then from those watts per kilo, you should be able to establish some degree of a VAM, so vertical ascension meters. A lot of times the VAM is ultimately what the climbing performance is. It is related to watts per kilo, but we were talking about technique and we're talking about mindset and we're talking about pacing. You need to nail all those things together to get that climbing speed on point. And so, again, that's why I come back to that like explosive power, because an athlete oftentimes can climb faster if they're going back and forth, kind of that volley over their threshold between explosive and just under the threshold. A lot of times they can get and create a lot more speed, a lot more climbing speed from using a pacing strategy like that, rather than just going right to the red line, sitting at that threshold and climbing at that. And you'll see almost any win of a mountain stage that happens, the athlete has to go above that threshold, has to go into those explosive zones at some point, either to get a gap or to follow another rider or if it's the bottom of the climb lead out, or, it's a super steep part of the climb or whatever it is. Almost never does an athlete just ride a steady power from the start of the climb to the finish to, achieve a top winning performance. Almost never. So I think that those metrics, or at least that perspective on those metrics, is the most helpful to predict a climbing performance or climbing metrics. But it's kind of funny, because if you go to like Strava climbs anywhere, if you go and you just grab a climb and you look on there's a handful of names you've never heard of that are all doing amazing climbing performances that are in line with the winning climb, like in the Tour de France or wherever. And so again, it's like, did you do that climb using your low threshold, or did you do that time freaking all out with the majority of yourself up against a wall, and you couldn't have gone any harder, and if you tried to slow down, you wouldn't recover. So for me, again, like, can you climb at that speed without being pinned against the wall? That's the key performance climbing way to interpret all that stuff. So, okay, why are some riders good KOM candidates but not good GC candidates? Well, it's kind of just like exactly what we just talked about there. Are you able to do the race to the way the GC race is raced to win on the climb, or do you need it to be a different scenario? Do you need it to be more punchy? Do you need it to be more steady? And a lot of times at the end of the day, the KOM candidates are breakaway artists. And a breakaway artist is very different than a GC rider, where, they don't necessarily have that low threshold super dial. They don't necessarily have that explosive, ability to kind of volley over the threshold back and forth. A lot of times they're just wide open or wide shut. And KOM candidates, like I did it. I've done some KOM jersey hunting myself. I never was good at it. I won the KOM jersey in Volta Catalunya, and I wanted to do GC in that race. My team wanted me to go in the breakaway and go for stage wins. And, the majority of the race stages, they all came down to either a sprint finish or a GC battle on top of the mountain. And so the way I handled the situation was, I was like, well, I'm going to go in every breakaway every day and try to win the stage. And so I went in every breakaway, every stage, and I didn't win a stage. I got close, but I did win the KOM jersey. And that wasn't good race style for me. It wasn't, I do better with the really hard pace on the last climb, and the KOM jersey breakaway style was more like kind of medium zone 2, like a lot of that, and then some real punchy sprint stuff to sprint for the point. So not the best for me, but I can see how there are a lot of strong candidates for that. And so, yeah, that's the difference between KOM and the GC jersey. Okay, so maybe your audience already has a good grasp of this, but you should give a good breakdown on climbing 3 to 7% and how important the drafting is versus 9% and up. And so this is an interesting question. In a nutshell, they're asking, how much does drafting affect on climbs? And the best answer for this is yes, it affects you a lot. And the reason for this is the World Tour homies are going so fast on the climbs that the speed is high. And so if it's 9% or 7% or 3%, the speed is still extremely high. And it's actually one of the reasons why the groups are sticking closer together in the finish, despite the performances going up, is because the speeds are so much higher on the climbs nowadays in the finishes that they are sticking together because there is so much more drafting because the speed is faster. And so drafting's huge. If you are just on the wheel, you're saving, 10 watts, 15 watts. I in Italy, I was riding every day with my son and Jackson and my training camp athletes and this guy, Rob Irish, who's super strong. And, every day, I would go up the climb with them and sit on the wheels. And sometimes even on my son, who's lighter than me, I was saving 20 watts a lot of the times just on his wheel. I would kind of pop out and look at him, look at his power meter and see where he was. And I'd see him like, wow, I'm 20 watts lower than him on this climb. So, the World Tour guys, I know I initially threw out 10 watts. I think it's more than that. Thinking about to my own experience and stuff, I think it's probably 20, 30 watts savings on the wheels on these climbs. So that's a zone. If your power to weight is a low threshold zone, when someone's pulling threshold on the front, a lot of times you could probably again get lower than that low threshold to be able to be on the wheel. And the significance of that too is that this is how these riders attack, is they have their team leader take the pace just to their low threshold, almost kind of like point where it's about to cross into the threshold, and they keep it right there. And the chances of the people behind them having to go above that are higher if they're better. And so it's kind of cool because that's how you can't do those big attacks like they do from your threshold. You have to be in that low threshold zone. And so that's why a lot of times we'll see Jonas or Tadej throw an attack and behind they can't even respond. And that's because those athletes that are in the draft, even with being in the draft, are at their threshold. And they almost kind of have to recover. And this is where a lot of times it will split up and come back together, is a rider that's already at his threshold is pegged. He can't follow the attack of the person that attacked from their low threshold. But then the question is, did that person who attacked go too far past their threshold when they attacked? And we saw this with Tadej. I believe it was like the second or third stage, where he threw this, haymaker freaking attack, but kind of came up short at the top of the climb, and Jonas was able to come back. And so I think he went too far into the red, too far away over his explosive zone, and had to shut it down back to his low threshold. And Jonas, who didn't go quite as hard, was able to still stay on the power he was on, kind of come back at the end. So anyway, drafting definitely makes a big difference. And so, again, nowadays, I guess the last part I'll talk about this is nowadays on the performance climbing side of it, that's why the acceleration is so important, because you need to snap these homies out of the draft. And so Jonas, who's like this massive sticky booger, to Tadej, he's almost perfect, right? He's smaller, he's got a good punch. And so he gets a perfect draft off Tadej. And if he can just make those accelerations, he's saving 20, 30 watts on the wheel. The zones are coming close together. He's hard to drop. And so Tadej's had to get even more creative on how am I going to drop this guy, because he can follow a lot of my accelerations. So kind of cool. We're over an hour, so I'm just going to do a couple more of these questions. Wow, there's just a lot of questions here. This is more of we asked the hardest climb in the U.S. What is the hardest climb in the U.S.? I would say that's Mount Washington. Super hard climb. Very, very steep. It's so steep, it feels like your head's going to explode off your body when you're climbing. I just remember that was a sensation that I had. It was so, so hard. This person referenced Powder Mountain. I think that's my favorite climb. I'd say Powder Mountain is almost as hard as Mount Washington. I would say Powder Mountain is as hard as Mount Washington, but it's like half the distance. So from what I remember, I think Mount Washington is like 2,000, or goes from 1,000 feet or something like that to 6,000 feet. It's like a crazy amount. And I think Powder Mountain is just a couple climbs, maybe 3,000 feet or something. So not as big of a change and not as much climbing. So were asking more questions about Pogačar. I think I gave a good answer on that. What separates Pogačar from Vingegaard on the climbing? And so there's a couple. This is a great question. I think we'll end on this. What is the difference between these two riders? Well, I think that the biggest difference between these two riders is Tadej has really reinvented the duration in zones that in combination of climbing zones that you can use. So I think if you just put the two together and they just did like an uphill time trial, and we saw this a couple of days ago, they're pretty close. And honestly, like had Jonas used probably a road bike and not a TT bike, the climbing section between the two would have been much closer. I think at the end, the gap may have more or less been the same. I don't know if Jonas really went faster because of the TT bike, but I think that the savings that he got in the beginning, he probably lost about the same in the end. That said, I think that, Tadej and Jonas would have been a lot closer on the steeper part had Jonas used the road bike. And so what's the difference? I think, again, Tadej's ability to use different amounts of the threshold zones and the explosive zones in key spots. And so what we've seen is that Tadej has trained this ability to go over his threshold for longer durations than probably we had thought was possible, and then be able to clear and recover at a power below threshold, and then quickly resume at that high threshold power faster. And so I think that he's changed the game in the amount of time that you can spend above your threshold on a climb, and then the amount of time you need to recover below your threshold from that. And then I think he's changed the speed at which you can get to that high threshold after those efforts. I think that's really, he generally makes the majority of his time in those bottom parts of the climb, which is a good part because that's where you have the most oxygen. That's where a hard effort like that will pay the biggest dividends. But yeah, I think that I think we all as coaches and as athletes, we think, okay, you can do this amount of time above, 15-second acceleration, 30-second acceleration. And, he's got this new thing, which is like 3 or 4 minutes, somewhere between the 30-second acceleration and, your 12-minute power. And so he's got this really, really crazy power. We've seen him perfect it in the classics that he is using on these short climbs. And then he's bringing this power into the high threshold after a short period of time at the low threshold and then going into it. So I think that's the biggest difference. I think Jonas has really focused a lot on his punchy accelerations, but I don't think he was prepared for Tadej to come out with this new weapon. And I think, when he was doing the classics, I think perhaps a lot of the athletes saw him doing the classics and thought, okay, he's doing the classics. He's looking to win these classics. And, I don't necessarily think that they knew he was using this to create a new weapon for his climbing. In terms of power to weight ratio and stuff like that, I would guess Jonas is very close to him. But again, power always trumps weight if the two ratios are the same. So both of them have similar power to weight ratio, except for Tadej has more power. And so once that gap's created, like we've seen, he extends it using the explosive power, but then I think the two of them sit at a pretty similar power to weight ratio, but Tadej goes faster due to having the higher amount of power. Anyway, that's my perspective on it. I think that it is going to be a battle in this last week. Looking at the Ventoux, I think that's a climb that favors Jonas. Knowing that, I think Tadej wants to win big on this climb and wants to probably go from the bottom. I don't know if we've seen someone go solo early on this climb. I think most of the time it's further up the climb when people attack. I think Tadej could do it any way he wants to. I know that it is more windy up top. And so, yeah, he's probably going to want to use, again, that strategy of him getting out of town sooner, at least before the tree line, and then going up solo. So we'll see what happens tomorrow. It should be exciting. And yeah, I think that's it. I think that's the nitty gritty on climbing performance, at least from your guys' questions. I'd love to do more of these on climbing. It's definitely an area that I have a lot of experience in, I'm passionate about, and I really enjoy talking about it. Obviously, it's been an hour, 20 minutes on this podcast. So I hope it's useful to you guys. I hope you enjoyed this format. Maybe we'll do more. We'll do questions and then answer them. And yeah, I'm going to go on a bike ride now, and I hope you guys have a great afternoon, and I'll see you on the Ventoux stage later.